Alexander the Great has just secured the Macedonian throne and achieved his first victory in battle as king against the free Thracians in the mountains. Now he moved on to his main opponents in the region, the Triballi. Arrian begins chapter 2 of the Anabasis of Alexander thus.
Alexander sent the booty away southward to the cities on the seashore, entrusting to Lysanias and Philotas the duty of setting it up for sale. But he himself crossed the summit, and advancing through the Haemus into the land of the Triballians, he arrived at the river Lyginus. This river is distant from the Ister 3 days' march to one intending to go to the Haemus. Sirmus, king of the Triballians, hearing of Alexander's expedition long before, had sent the women and children of the nation in advance to the Ister, ordering them to pass over into one of the islands in that river, the name of which was Peuce. To this island also the Thracians, whose territories were conterminous with those of the Triballians, had fled together for refuge at the approach of Alexander. Sirmus himself likewise, accompanied by his train, had fled for refuge to the same place. But the main body of the Triballians fled back to the river, from which Alexander had started the day before.
There isn't more known about the officers sent back to sell plunder and captives, nor is certain the location of the river Lyginus. Perhaps it could be any of the rivers Yantra, Iskar, or Rositsa. As for the island Peuce, it too is indiscernible today, due to the changing of Danube's course and currents. In any case, Danube in its lower course was a sight that most, if not all of the Macedonian force hadn't seen before. This extremely wide river of strong currents must have put many of them in awe. While many free Thracians and Triballi noncombatants took refuge on the island Peuce, the main army attempted to flank Alexander, preventing any routes of retreat through the mountain passes. But Alexander learned of this.
When he heard of their move, he wheeled round again, and marching against them, surprised them just as they were encamping. And those who were surprised drew themselves up in battle array in a woody glen along the bank of the river. Alexander drew out his phalanx into a deep column, and led it on in person. He also ordered the archers and slingers to run forward and discharge arrows and stones at the barbarians, hoping to provoke them by this to come out of the woody valley into the ground unencumbered with trees. When they were within reach of the missiles, and were struck by them, they rushed out against the archers, who were undefended by shields, with the purpose of fighting them hand to hand. But when Alexander had drawn them thus out of the woody glen, he ordered Philotas to take the cavalry which came from Upper Macedonia, and to charge their right wing, where they had advanced furthest in their sally. He also commanded Heracles and Sopolis to lead on the cavalry which came from Botia and Amphipolis against the left wing, while he himself extended the phalanx of infantry and the rest of the horses in front of the phalanx and led them against the enemy's center.
Alexander caught his opponents by surprise while they were encamped by a forest in a gorge. Even later, he would avoid confronting enemies on such terrain. Instead, he ordered his archers and slingers to harass them and bait them onto the open ground. The plan worked, and the Triballi rushed towards the archers and the light infantry. Alexander ordered Philotas to lead the cavalry from Upper Macedonia and charge at the enemy's right wing that made the biggest advance. This Philotas, unlike the fellow mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, was the eldest son of Parmenion, the most senior of Alexander's generals. Parmenion was Alexander's second-in-command, a position he held under Philip as well, and led a large army bound for Asia Minor, in preparation for the attack on the Persians. He was also instrumental by putting to death Attalus, one of potential opponents to Alexander's ascension which we mentioned in the previous episode. Between this favor and Parmenion's influence, he managed to keep his position and place his relatives and friends in other key positions in the Macedonian military and government. Philotas, who became commander of the cavalry companions, was only one such. The Upper Macedonian cavalry unit, which Philotas now led in a charge, will not be mentioned by Arrian again. One possible reason is that they were left behind in Europe, after Alexander marched into Asia. Meanwhile, two other generals, Heracles and Sopolis, led cavalry from Botia and Amphipolis to the enemy's left. They will see even more action later in the Alexander's campaign. Meanwhile, Alexander took the rest of the cavalry and the phalanx and charged in the center. Looking forward, it would become unusual to see Alexander in this position, as his trademark position would be leading the companion cavalry on the right wing. Arrian describes the continuation of the battle.
And indeed, as long as there was only skirmishing on both sides, the Triballians did not get the worst of it, but as soon as the phalanx in dense array attacked them with vigor, and the cavalry fell upon them in various quarters, no longer merely striking them with the javelin, but pushing them with their very horses, then at length they turned and fled through the woody glen to the river. 3,000 were slain in the flight, few of them were taken prisoners, both because there was a dense wood in front of the river, and the approach of night deprived the Macedonians of certainty in their pursuit. Ptolemy says that of the Macedonians themselves 11 horsemen and about 40-foot soldiers were killed.
Once the skirmishing ended and the full force of the Macedonian army pressed forward, the Triballian lines broke and they were slaughtered in the pursuit. While Alexander would always be willing to make peace with his opponents, oftentimes he pushed his victory as far as he could. In hindsight, it is interesting to wonder what he thought of these barbarians of the north. Himself a Macedonian, he carried a similar label for the civilized, southern Greek states. Worse, his mother being from Epirus, which had even worse reputation than Macedonia, didn't help either. But what we can definitely say is that this battle, if not the people, made some kind of impression. He saw firsthand how damaging a chaotic retreat could be to an army. 10 years from now, after traveling to the edge of the known world, he would address his soldiers by saying, "While I have led you, not one of you has been killed in flight." The Triballi were not so lucky. The number of wounded is rarely mentioned in ancient narratives, but they usually averaged 8 to 12 for one killed. The number of casualties Arrian once again attributes to Ptolemy, though similar numbers and events are probably also described in other lost sources Arrian draws upon. Alexander is definitely presented in a good light. This is similar to the battle at Hemus where allegedly no soldier was lost, though this number only relates to those killed by the rushing carts, not the whole battle. As for Alexander, once more there is no indecision or doubt, only sound strategic and tactical maneuvers. In this regard, he resembles his cold and efficient ascension to the throne. His calculative decision-making is already making him seem something more than a human, even if in a subtle way. It is interesting to consider whether this was all propaganda for Alexander, and indirectly Ptolemy, or if Alexander was really like that in character. Whatever the case, Alexander portrays traits that would be popular even in today's society. He is a born leader, decisive, and brave. More importantly, he has been pocketing victory after victory so far, and it is easy to follow someone like that, be it in battlefield, sports, or social media. So far, his continuing stroke of genius doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. Moving on to Chapter 3, Arrian begins.
On the third day after the battle, Alexander reached the river Ister, which is the largest of all the rivers in Europe, traverses a very great tract of country, and separates very warlike nations. Most of these belong to the Celtic race, in whose territory the sources of the river take their rise. Of these nations the remotest are the Quadi and Marcomanni, then the Yazygs, a branch of the Sauromations, then the Getae, who hold the doctrine of immortality, then the main body of the Sauromations, and, lastly, the Scythians, whose land stretches as far as the outlets of the river, where through 5 mouths it discharges its water into the Euxine Sea.
In this part, Arrian gives us a good general description of people living around the continent. In the last centuries BC, Celts were in many ways masters of Europe. Though not unified under a single state, but instead fragmented among many tribes, these spread from British Isles, Iberia, and to the Balkans. We will see more of Celts later on. Quadi and Marcomanni were Germanic tribes living around the areas of Moravia and Bohemia respectively. Yazygs were a nomadic tribe, originating in Central Asia until settling in the Pannonian Plain. They were a part of the tribal confederation of Sarmatians. All these peoples were unknown to Alexander, but have lived in said territories in Arrian's time. Getae lived on the other side of the Danube. They have a strong relation to the Dacians, but whether they are the same people remains disputed even today. The part about immortality is a reference to Herodotus' histories. Herodotus writes how the Getae believe that they don't really die, but that when they perish they go to their deity, Zalmoxis. The next mentioned people, Scythians, were another people of the steppe, most prominent around the northern Black Sea, then known as Euxine Sea. Arrian continues.
Here Alexander found some warships which had come to him from Byzantium, through the Euxine Sea and up the river. Filling these with archers and heavy-armed troops, he sailed to the island to which the Triballians and Thracians had fled for refuge. He tried to force a landing, but the barbarians came to meet him at the brink of the river, where the ships were making the assault. But ships were only few in number, and the army in them small. The shores of the island, also, were in most places too steep and precipitous for landing, and the current of the river alongside it, being, as it were, shut up into a narrow channel by the nearness of the banks, was rapid and exceedingly difficult to stem. Alexander therefore led back his ships, and determined to cross the Ister and march against the Getae, who dwelt on the other side of that river, for he observed that many of them had collected on the bank of the river for the purpose of barring his way if he should cross. There were of them about 4,000 cavalry and more than 10,000 infantry. At the same time a strong desire seized him to advance beyond the Ister.
Despite being reinforced by additional ships that arrived from the Black Sea, Alexander couldn't force the landing. Again, we can only wonder how much, if any, frustration this setback, the first of its kind, caused him. Arrian remained silent about this, as had presumably his principal sources. The Getae themselves seem to have had some kind of truce, or even an alliance in place with the besieged Triballi, protecting their flank and a potential line of retreat. Alexander concluded that if he defeated the Getae, the people of the island would be surrounded and would have to surrender. It is Arrian's last line that is perhaps the most interesting and gives us a great insight into Alexander's character. The strong desire to reach the other side of the Danube is a translation of the word pothos. This term repeats many times across the Arrian's work, indicating that it comes from his main source of Ptolemy, though some researchers argue that such trait contradicts the depiction of Alexander as a calculating commander, leaving open the possibility that this was Arrian's own deduction or insight into Alexander's personality, or that it was perhaps mentioned in another source. Regardless, the frequent repeatings of the term, as well as the great feats connected to them, crossing the Danube and Indus and building of Alexandria, definitely lead us to believe it was one of the main and most interesting characteristics, according to Arrian. This is, perhaps, his inner explorer, always trying to find out what's after the next milestone, and then the next, and then the next. Horizon, for Alexander, was always a line that he had to pass, and no challenge was beyond him. Alexander had an ambition, sure, but this longing, this strong desire, seems to reveal another, different aspect of his layered personality. In this case, his strong desire also had a practical side. The Danube was the northernmost border of the known Greek world. Whatever laid beyond were only rumors, legends, and fairy tales, and the barbarians living beyond were fierce raiders and warriors. But if he crossed the Danube now, that ought to make them think twice before they crossed onto his. Not a daring taunt, but quite the opposite, a threat that would secure Macedonian northern flank while campaigning in Asia. The Getae, on the other side, seemed to believe that even with ships, it would take a long time to organize a large enough transport to the other side of the Danube, leaving them with an advantage. To reach the other side, Alexander forged another plan.
He therefore went on board the fleet himself. He also filled with hay the hides which served them as tent coverings, and collected from the country around all the boats made from single trunks of trees. Of these there was a great abundance, because the people who dwell near the Ister use them for fishing in the river, sometimes also for journeying to each other for traffic up the river, and most of them carry on piracy with them. Having collected as many of these as he could, upon them he conveyed across as many of his soldiers as was possible in such a fashion. Those who crossed with Alexander amounted in number to 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 infantry.
Another Greek general and philosopher once attempted something similar. Xenophon, who on a large scale influenced Arrian, describes in his one memoirs, also titled Anabasis, a journey of his mercenary army into Mesopotamia. Xenophon died soon after Alexander's birth, but there remains a general consensus amongst scholars that Alexander too was influenced by this Athenian general. It was probably Aristotle who, if not introduced, then better presented Xenophon's work to young Alexander. And just as Xenophon had used leather tent covers to create rafts and cross Euphrates, now Alexander attempted to replicate at Danube. Alongside he confiscated many dugout canoes from the area. Two things are left of note. Since Alexander went aboard a ship, it is reasonable to assume that his cavalry went with him. However, there remains a question if these would be able to transport the entire 1,500. It's more probable that at least some of the horses had to swim across the Danube to reach the other side. And the second thing, you might think that Alexander's army was heavily outnumbered, his 4,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry against the 10,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry of Getae. And you would be right. How will Alexander tackle the Getae warriors, with a smaller army that has to cross one of the mightiest rivers in Europe, and successfully disembark and form up before even engaging their foe? We will find out in the next chapter.